husband had tired of her. Disgusted and betrayed, He Zejun finally left Yan'an and Mao. Lan Ping and Mao Zedong first became acquainted in the fall of 1938, when Mao came to give a talk at the college. Lan Ping was present, listening raptly as Mao discussed the social and political importance of art, and she rose to her feet to clap enthusiastically when he finished his speech. Mao was much less remote to his supporters at this early stage and easily approachable on the streets of Yan'an. Lan Ping found the courage to introduce herself to Mao after his lecture, and the two shared some brief and friendly conversation. They continued to meet and spend time together in the ensuing weeks, and soon became lovers. When they decided to marry, the couple encountered significant opposition from Mao's fellow communist leaders, particularly the future Premier Zhou Enlai, General Zhu De, and Chief of Staff Liu Xiaoqi. Lan Ping was controversial. She had come to Yan'an from Shanghai, a nationalist stronghold that most rural communists considered bloated with bourgeois privilege, excess, and permissive nods to capitalism and imperialism. She was also attractive, stylish, and modern, everything that the poor, unpolished, and hard-working proletariat was supposed to despise according to communist theory. Mao insisted to his top officials, however, that his marriage to Lan was necessary. Without her love, he said, he could not continue the revolution. He even threatened to return home to Hunan province and become a mere farmer. The party and military officials surrounding Mao eventually relented. He was granted a divorce from He Zejun and permitted to marry Lan Ping, as long as she stayed out of the running of the communist hierarchy. Thus, within just a year and a half of her arrival at Yan'an, Lan Ping was married to one of the most powerful men in China. To mark the occasion of their wedding, they chose Lan Ping's new name together, Jiangqing, meaning Green River. It referenced a line from a sentimental Tang Dynasty poem. The first 10 years of Jiang and Mao's marriage were harmonious between them, though they were lived against the backdrop of the immensely destructive war with Japan down to 1945, and then the resumption of the civil war with the nationalists. Jiangqing gave birth to a daughter in 1940, the only child she and Mao would have together. Interestingly, the girl was not given her father's name, instead being given Jiang's original maiden name. Li Na lived closely with both her parents during her early childhood and could often be found playing on the floor of her father's office while Mao was working or taking meetings with party members. She was raised as a sister to He Zejun's youngest daughter Li Min, who, strangely, was also given Jiang's maiden name. Though she had railed all her life against submitting to traditional marriage and domesticity, Jiang nonetheless seemed happy in these early years. She served as one of Mao's secretaries, a vague and barely articulated position which included report writing and general paperwork on Mao's behalf. She was honored as Mao's wife and admired for her seeming grit during the war against the Japanese and later the struggle with the nationalists. As time went by, she began to demand special accommodations and was invariably catered to. Such was her influence with Mao. Even when the ardor of their marriage began to fade and Mao's eye began to wander to younger women once again, Jiang did not react the way her predecessor had. She tolerated his many mistresses and affairs. In 1949, the Communists finally defeated the Nationalists, the remnants of which fled under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan. Mao's triumphant establishment as the ruler of the new People's Republic of China created greater distance between husband and wife. Mao was now busier than ever, and the bureaucratic and security apparatus which grew up around him at the capital in Beijing served to remove Jiang Qing from her husband's daily routine. As the wife of a leading revolutionary on the road, her presence during strategy and policy discussions had been accepted. Now, in the halls of power, where women were rarely, if ever, elevated to influential positions in China, she found herself excluded. She had faced significant health challenges during the war, even suffering from an attack of tuberculosis, for which she underwent a month of treatment in the Soviet Union. But it was when Jiang Qing found herself blocked from any position of power that Jiang's health, both physical and mental, began to suffer. Aware of her desire to be more than a secretary, Mao arranged for Jiang to head one or two committees charged with assessing theatre and film for alignment with party politics. Initially excited and motivated, Jiang dove into the work. But she soon began to find the position infuriating, as her recommendations were only heeded when Mao happened to agree with them, which he frequently did not. Her working relationships worsened, as did her colleagues' opinions of her. Jiang had always been a defiant, forceful personality and difficult to work with, but now she became even more difficult. Numerous interviews with contemporaries recalled Jiang's increasingly unreasonable behavior in the 1950s. She made many enemies among Chinese filmmakers, playwrights, and theatre directors for criticizing or attempting to ban their work. Though Jiang was now a mature and politically powerful woman, she had gained little more intellectual sophistication. She believed that art in the new China should only focus on and celebrate proletarian victory and communist values. Anger from her painful childhood may have also been at play here, with her ideas about political justice being bound up with the notion of personal vengeance. Those who displeased her often found themselves and their work dealt with more harshly than they deserved to be. Her feelings of impotence and her anxiety at the new distance between her and her husband began to manifest in her health. Depressed and bored to distraction, she began to complain of feeling physically ill. Dr. Li Sui, Mao's private doctor, recalled that as far as he could see, there was nothing really wrong with Jiang Qing. Her frequent fatigue, mysterious aches and pains, heart palpitations and anxiety were common, he said, to virtually all of the patients he treated among Mao's inner circle. The exceptionally high stress and culture of fear which prevailed among those at the top of the power structure was striking. Jiang Qing was sent away to the Soviet Union several times during the 1950s to convalesce in private hospitals. Sometimes she got the impression that her husband was sending her away to avoid her or keep her from meddling further in politics. She received few visitors, but one notable and reliable caller was Zhou Enlai. Though several of Mao's top officials visited the Soviet Union periodically, few of them liked Jiang enough to pay her a visit. Zhou, however, was one of the few power brokers who remained unfailingly kind to her, whatever he thought of Jiang personally. He brought her delicacies and news from home, making every effort to cheer her up, for which she was grateful. Despite this, Jiang would eventually alienate him too, by attempting to have him removed from office. In 1955, it was confirmed that Jiang was genuinely ill after tests revealed that she had cervical cancer. She returned to the Soviet Union for cobalt-60 treatments and remained there for over a year, recovering. She was made quite comfortable in a private hospital in Moscow and a resort in Yalta with access to a film projector and a regularly replenished selection of Western movies, technically banned in both Russia and China. She ate well, listened to opera, and read a great deal. Her attitude toward those she considered subordinates, however, continued to get worse. She would complain that her bathwater or the temperature in her room was too hot one moment and then too cold when her staff tried to address the issue. By the time Jiang Qing returned to Beijing, a new decade had dawned and the political situation in the capital was quite different. Mao's popularity had declined in the wake of the Great Leap Forward, the chairman's disastrously executed 5-year plan to reorganize agricultural activity and maximize the growth of Chinese industry. The results had been horrific, leading to one of the worst famines in human history, during which tens of millions of people died of starvation. Trenchant criticism of Mao was now rising across China, even amongst Politburo members and Mao's top officials. But rather than admit the failures and human miseries resulting from his regime, Mao doubled down. He sought instead to cement his power through a program of cultural and artistic reform which would squash such avenues of dissent and allay any challenges to his power from popular leaders of the communist movement like Deng Xiaoping or Zhou Enlai. It was in this context that Mao finally granted power to Jiang Qing, of the kind which he had long sought. She would become one of the key architects of the Cultural Revolution that sought to reaffirm Mao's control over Communist China from 1966 onwards. As one of the main organizers of it, Jiang was a member of the Gang of Four along with Jiang Chongqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen. This quartet oversaw the Cultural Revolution on Mao's behalf, though Jiang was the most powerful of the four. The Cultural Revolution was geared around the idea of instilling a rigorous communist purity into Chinese society. Jiang Qing began by reading and evaluating more than 1,000 artistic works, including films, operas, plays, and ballets, for their conformity to the Maoist principles of socialism, as well as for their lionization of the proletariat. Any works that did not conform to the party line, any art that glorified the wealthy, capitalists, imperialists, past emperors, or the aristocracy, was deemed bourgeois or counter-revolutionary, and were either reformed or banned. Jiang also undertook to identify the most superior works of art in this respect, and made sure they were recognized publicly as good art, both politically and morally sound. Thousands of artists whose works made them politically suspect had their reputations and livelihoods ruined, and came under attack from Red Guards, which were often little more than gangs of violent youths whipped up into a frenzy by Mao's Cultural Revolution. Those whose political crimes were considered especially egregious were fired from their jobs or forced to undergo ritualized public humiliation, marching slowly through the streets in dunce caps while the crowds jeered and abused them. The most controversial political offenders were imprisoned, some for years on end, and most without charge or trial. Worst of all, Jiang seemed often to wield her terrible new influence on those against whom she held personal grudges. For Jiang, class struggle was a vengeful process in which the proletariat punished and subordinated their oppressors. Jiang's role in the Cultural Revolution saw her reach a position of power which she had never previously held in China, although Mao still ultimately made the final call on all matters of policy. It was the chairman's habit to discreetly pit the most powerful and closest to him against one another in order to keep himself at the center of all possible intrigue. He often criticized one official to another, just to test them, to see how they would respond. Still, Jiang was certainly one of the most powerful people in China between 1966 and 1976. Under her direction, Red Guards terrorized teachers and lecturers in the country's schools and universities, accusing them of political impurity, while the nation's cinemas, libraries, and theaters all became battlegrounds in the bizarre conflict which was both an effort to enforce political purity and also a performative campaign in which the government was well aware that it was systematically terrorizing innocent people with the primary aim of strengthening Mao's position after the disastrous years of the Great Leap Forward. The worst years of the Cultural Revolution, which would ultimately claim the lives of anywhere between 500,000 and 2 million Chinese people in waves of political violence, took place between 1966 and 1969, though it dragged on well into the 1970s. By the mid-1970s, it became clear that the chairman's continued ill health indicated that he was in the final stages of Lou Gehrig's disease, and the talk around him began to turn to succession. It is important to remember that Jiang was only just about to enter her early 60s. Following the death of Zhou Enlai from cancer early in 1976 and the ousting of Deng Xiaoping, she may have believed that there was a path to her claiming power once Mao died. Though she had made many enemies during her rise to power, she had the support of roughly 40% of the Politburo. Jiang also had a good deal of support among China's youth, rural workers, and roughly half the army. During the summer of 1976, Mao sent Jiang what one biographer described as a farewell poem. "You have been wronged," it read. "Today we are separating into 2 worlds. May each keep his peace. In the struggle of the past 10 years, I have tried to reach the peak of revolution, but I was not successful. You, though, could reach the top. If you fail, you will plunge into a fathomless abyss. Your body will shatter. Your bones will break." This missive seems to suggest that Jiang had Mao's support to become Madam Chairwoman after his passing. And yet, when the top officials came together some weeks later for their final meeting with Mao at his bedside, he appeared much more ambivalent about his wife's potential succession. In fact, he stated quite clearly that he did not think there should be any sort of presidency at all after he died, but that a broad, multi-generational coalition should govern and lead together. "It is up to the Politburo to decide whether Jiang Qing shall be included," he said. Toward the end of his speech, his voice began to fail as he grew weaker. "Help Jiang Qing," he began, before his voice trailed off, and the party members strained to hear his last muttered whisper. His wife's supporters among them claimed that he said, "Help Jiang Qing carry the red flag." Moderates in the room claimed he said, "Help Jiang Qing correct her errors." Mao died on the 6th of September 1976. By then, Jiang had failed to cultivate any support among Mao's top officials or attempt to repair relations with those whose enmity she had earned over the years. At a meeting of the Politburo just days after Mao's death, she encountered no immediate opposition. But less than 2 days after they adjourned, guards sent by the top political and military officials burst into Jiang's bedroom in the middle of the night and arrested her. Jiang spent 4 years incarcerated without charge or trial, though the conditions in which she lived were quite good, and she was permitted regular visits from her daughter Li Na. By 1980, Deng Xiaoping had claimed power and was overseeing a program of reform that rejected Mao's legacy. The Politburo, in order to put the past behind them, now turned their attention to Jiang Qing once again. She could not be released because of her previous role in the Cultural Revolution, but neither could they make her a martyr for unreformed Maoists. Deng was facing criticism from the left for seeming to have betrayed the revolution with his more moderate policies. The way to rewrite and contextualize history, the moderates believed, was not to blame Mao for the failures of the revolution that many still deeply revered. It seemed far easier to blame Jiang Qing and the other members of the Gang of Four who had overseen the Cultural Revolution. Jiang Qing expressed incredulity when she was informed that she would be placed on trial 4 years after the death of Mao and her arrest. Nonetheless, on the 20th of November 1980, the trial of Jiang and the other 3 members of the Gang of Four began. They were charged with anti-party activities and the persecution of hundreds of thousands of people, leading to tens of thousands of deaths. Far from being cowed by those who sought to force a confession, Jiang remained defiant and unwilling to acknowledge or admit any guilt. She reiterated that her so-called crimes were political and were committed under direct orders from Mao. If she were a criminal, Jiang insisted, then so were most of her judges. They too had carried out Mao's orders to persecute individuals and to use the powers of the state according to the chairman's direction. "I was Chairman Mao's dog," Jiang insisted. "I bit whomever he asked me to bite." "What you are doing now," she continued, "is asking a widow to pay her husband's debt. To you all I say, I am happy and honored to pay Chairman Mao's debt." The trial continued for several days, but it was effectively a show trial for Jiang and the other 3 members of the Gang of Four. In the end, when the ruling came down in January 1981, Jiang Qing was found guilty and sentenced to death. However, the judges, still afraid of popular unrest, commuted her sentence to life in prison, provided that she maintained good behavior. Jiang spent the last 11 years of her life incarcerated. In the mid-1980s, she contracted throat cancer and was temporarily released to hospital care for treatment. Watching China slowly change outside her windows, Jiang began to fall into depression. Just as the Soviet Union had gradually reformed in the 1950s and 1960s after the passing of Joseph Stalin, so too China moved to a different model after Mao's time. A new economy with some Western elements was developing, one that would prove far more successful than the controlled economy Mao had disastrously tried to oversee. By the end of the 1980s, it was clear that a new country was emerging, in which Deng's reforms were the key determinant, not Mao's legacy. As Jiang grew older and sicker, she fell into despair. In the early morning hours of the 14th of May 1991, Jiang Qing took her own life. She was 77 years old. The note she left behind read, "Today the revolution has been stolen by the revisionist clique, and the result of this omission is that unending evils have been unleashed on the Chinese people and nation. Chairman, your student and fighter is coming to see you." The Politburo would not permit Jiang Qing to have a funeral. She and Mao had wished to be buried next to one another, but their last wishes were not adhered to. While Mao was mummified and placed on display in a memorial building in Tiananmen Square, a stern and forbidding sentinel forever guarding the spirit of the revolution, Jiang was quietly cremated and her remains laid to rest in Futian Cemetery in Beijing. Her grave marker bears the name Li Yun-he, not Jiang Qing. Jiang Qing, or the White-Boned Demon as she came to be known, had lived across most of the events which transformed modern China. She was born just 3 years after the millennia-old imperial system came to an end, and she lived through the Civil War, the Second World War, and the establishment of the People's Republic. She had had many names and many lives, first as a poor child, then as an actress, then as a politician's wife, and finally as one of the orchestrators of the Cultural Revolution. Her position was somewhat strange to an extent. Mao and the Communist Party did not allow her to wield much power as his wife for many years. It was only in 1966, after the disaster of the Great Leap Forward had threatened Mao's hold on power, that she truly rose to prominence, as Mao tried to utilize the Cultural Revolution as a means of re-cementing his position. It was then that she finally rose to prominence as a member of the Gang of Four. Over the next decade, her influence over China was entirely nefarious. The Cultural Revolution ultimately led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of Chinese people. The exact numbers are unknown. Worse still was the collective scarring of Chinese society as it attacked itself for the better part of a decade. Though Mao could never be criticized by the government of the country he shaped so much in the 20th century, after his death, those who had survived sought revenge against the Gang of Four. Far from claiming any sort of power for herself, the Cultural Revolution was ultimately the undoing of Jiang Qing as well. What do you think of Jiang Qing? Does she deserve to be as reviled as she is, or has she been unduly demonized because her detractors could never publicly criticize Mao, since criticizing Mao was to admit that the revolution had failed? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.